question is, what happens if you combine the two? What happens if you strap buttered toast to the back of a cat? You push the cat from the table, and what you get is probably the only known way of producing an anti-gravity effect, because the cat stops short of hitting the floor and goes into a spinning motion. Paradoxes confuse us, they puzzle us, they challenge further inquiry, they produce frowns on our foreheads, and that's why they're important for academic research. But not all paradoxes are resolved as easily as the buttered cat paradox. This is the kind of paradox physicists come up with when they are tired of thinking of other paradoxes, because paradoxes are at the heart of physics. Some of you may have heard of paradoxes like the time travel paradox. It assumes that you travel back in time, kill your younger self. But then if you kill yourself, of course you can't grow up to then travel back in time, kill yourself. So you don't kill yourself, but if you don't kill yourself, you can then again grow up, go back in time, kill yourself, and so on. Cannot be resolved. Another paradox, the so-called Fermi paradox. Italian physicist Enrico Fermi, he said with billions and billions of galaxies in the universe, it's almost 100% likely that there is a civilization out there that has interstellar travel. So why haven't they visited us? Where are they? Is the motto of the Fermi paradox. And then the one that inspired the buttered cat paradox, Schrödinger's cat, Austrian physicist Erwin Schrödinger, said, the life of a cat is linked to the decay of a particular radioactive atom. And the laws of quantum physics say you don't know whether the atom is decayed or not unless you look at it. So that's why the cat here is wanted dead and alive. So paradoxes are at the heart of physics, but they're also at the heart of social science inquiry, in particular at the heart of mega events. I would even go so far as to say it's the constitutive nature of mega events to be paradoxical. A couple of things that make mega events paradoxical. One is that they are supposed to address a universal humankind, but really are very nationalist endeavors. It's all about future legacies, but at the same time, nowhere is the focus on the here and now so intense as an Olympic organizing committee. Sports mega events are all about complying with very strict rules. Yet nowhere is rule bending, whether through doping or through other ways of cheating, as prominent. They're all about inclusion, reaching out to the population, yet nowhere do we see such a high degree of exclusion. And they're all about destroying the old infrastructure, old stadia, old modes of behavior, but at the same time at creating new things. And that's why one urban scholar has called mega events forces of creative destruction, a paradox in itself. That mega events are so ridden with paradox is perhaps because they are creatures and drivers of modernity. And one of the most prominent social and cultural analyses of mega events exactly put them in a very direct tense relationship with modernity. I'm talking about Maurice Roche's mega events and modernity. And he says that mega events have helped structure the social space and time dimensions of modernity. What he means there is, on one hand, that they are tightly linked to globalization. They bring together people from around the world, and they reach out to draw that world together through international media. And the time dimensions, if you think of how mega events structure daily rhythms, of how a World Cup structures daily rhythms in Germany, how people plan their appointments, how people plan their evenings. So this tight link between mega events and modernity is something that's very characteristic for these kinds of events. But that also makes them very open to the idea of paradox. Because if you follow Marshall Berman, then to be modern is to live a life of paradox and contradiction. Marshall Berman is a philosopher, and he sees paradox as a key element of modernity. And the key paradox of modernity for him is that the very inventions that are meant to grant us freedom enslave us in modernity. Fordism, organized mass production, would be one of those examples that he sees as the paradoxes of modernity. Now, what I find interesting about this quote here, to live a life of paradox and contradiction, is that he seems to equate, or at least consider as very similar, the two terms of paradox and contradiction. And although they're similar, I would argue that there is an important difference between paradox and contradiction. A contradiction refers to opposites that exclude each other. Only one of the two parts of a contradiction can prevail. Paradox also has opposites, but it accommodates two conflicting statements. Both of them can prevail, both of them can be true. Brian Masumi put it like this: what are normally opposites coexist, coalesce, connect in many events. Paradoxes help us focus on the tensions that are inherent to the late modern condition. They help us not immediately try and resolve the tension and say, well, this is true or that is true, but to consider the possibility that maybe both statements are true. And encourage us to explore this tension of conflicting statements in greater depth. I would argue that there are at least 8 paradoxes central to mega events, and I explore all 8 in a working paper that's at the basis of this talk. But I'll only touch on 5 of them very briefly, and then go into 3 that are of great relevance also for mega events as an urban factor in urban development. So the 8 paradoxes. The universalism paradox, the fact that mega events are often declared to transcend national boundaries, but enforce nationalism at the same time. Participation paradox, mega events involve people, yet are highly exclusive at the same time. The winner's paradox from economics, whoever wins the bid for mega event makes a net loss. The compliance paradox, mega events require strict rule compliance, yet nowhere is exception to the rules as omnipresent. That can be construed as exception to sporting rules, but also to regular legislation. If you think of the kind of exceptional legislation that is enacted when preparing for many big mega events. The uniqueness paradox, a once-in-a-lifetime phenomenon. Mega events mostly consist of routines and repetition. And the 3 that I want to talk about in a little more detail are the future paradox, the planning paradox, and the passion paradox. And the passion paradox will return us to the I love them not of the total. The future paradox. Hosting a mega event is supposed to be not only about a few weeks of high-level sports, it is above all meant to be a forward-looking investment. And this has been framed very at a very high level of profile, also in talks today, as of the debate about legacy. Hosting mega events is all about long-term legacies. This is also was key in the organization of the London 2012 Olympics. I'm going to present you a number of quotes from the chairman of London 2012 of the organizing committee, Sebastian Coe. In May 2006, he had to say the following about legacy. Legacy is absolutely epicentral to the plans for 2012. Legacy is probably 9/10 of what this process is about, not just 16 days of Olympic sport. Yet the second part of the paradox is that the focus on the here and now dominates decision-making related to mega events. So listen to what he had to say just 1 year later about organizing the Olympic Games in London. 50% of the organizing team are working on making sure that the games are working functionally at games time, and the other 50% spend every working hour worrying about what it is we're going to do with these facilities afterwards. So notice here that he's a very quantitative person, as you can see. Legacy has shrunk from 90% to 50% within a year. Now this is what he said just a couple of months before the games were due to open. I don't want this to sound like this legacy planning is not my job, but actually it isn't. This begins after 2012. We finish and go off and do whatever we do. So here, by now, a couple of months before the event. The focus on the here and now completely displays the idea that everything is about long-term legacies. This is a phenomenon I've called in another paper on the World Cup 2018, event seizure, a process whereby the event, the urgency connected with the event seizes everything, resources, infrastructural priorities, even legislation. The size and complexity of a mega event make it necessary to conduct very detailed advanced planning. And Hamburger went through the very first stages of this kind of advanced planning you do during the bid stage. This takes me to the second paradox, the planning paradox. You cannot rerun the 100-meter sprint finals. This was a sentence I heard very often in the research that I conducted. My research is mostly on the logics of organizing the Olympic Games and the Football World Cup. So I looked at organizing committees, but also at planning departments in the cities. What this sentence wants to say is that there's no chance for trial and error. And indeed, it would be very strange to imagine asking Usain Bolt, who you can see in the middle, would you please return to the starter blocks again because the camera at the finish line wasn't ready, and would you please run the sprint for a second time? So everything needs to work at the first go. So behind the scenes, invisible to the eye of the media spectator, Olympic planning produces an enormous amount of documentation. Business plans, risk assessment, project schedules, contingency budgets, then your operating plans, knowledge reports. Any bureaucracy would go pale in envy of the amount of documents and paper an Olympic organizing committee produces. And that has to do with two things. One thing is that an Olympic organizing committee reports to many different organizations, not just to the IOC, but also to the funders, often the national government, the regional government, and the city, the international federations. They report to the sponsors. They need to be accountable to the media and to the citizens as well. And each of those stakeholders expects a very different kind of communication and a very different kind of interest that needs to be represented in the planning. Why is planning also so extensive? Well, because you need to plan not just for what is, but for what could be. So contingency planning, planning for all eventualities, all possible risks, is very extensive and also produces a lot of documentation and a strong focus on planning ahead. Here's where the planning paradox comes in. Mega events are planned down to the last detail. This is what I just described. Partly because you have media attention attached to them. Every second needs to be planned precisely because you know that media programming around the world relies on your event opening at the very second you promise that it opened. But at the same time, improvisation is commonplace. When I conduct some interviews, one of the interview partners compared planning the Olympic Games in the following way to managing a train crash. It is like dealing with an inevitable train crash. You know the train is going to crash. The question is how you get everyone safely from board. So many Olympic organizers are aware that things are going to go wrong despite the planning down to the last detail. So they need to resort to improvisation when these things indeed go wrong. So knowing this question, the planning paradox, the extensive planning, but at the same time, the need for improvisation. The question is, who would be the perfect Olympic CEO? Who could head up the Olympic Organizing Committee? Would you rather have the almighty CEO that keeps an overview, perhaps like this person here? You can imagine him commanding the armies of volunteers, the tens of thousands of volunteers and staff that are needed for Olympic Games, from the commanding heights of, and all of you recognize the Tower of Isengard, of course. The almighty, all-seeing, all-knowing wizard, chief wizard, I should say, of Isengard. Or would you rather want to have somebody like this in charge of the Olympic Games?
you got a golden ballerina between your knees and no rings. Now what?
MacGyver, of course, the 1980s American pop cultural icon, who with a paperclip saves himself and people around him from this exploding bomb. The allegory here, of course, playing to a very short-term improvisation that in many cases happens behind the scenes in the Olympic Games, where you have to make do with whatever resources you have. If that is only a paperclip, then that is only a paperclip. So which of the two would you hire for Olympic CEO? The answer is, of course, both. Although they're very opposite characters, but that encapsulates the planning paradox. You do not get improvisation without the large-scale advanced planning that you have at the beginning, and you can't just improvise without planning in advance. So although with future orientation and planning, we can say a lot about what mega events are and how we prepare for them. I think ultimately events are not much about planning, but about the experience that is connected to them. The feelings, the passion. And that finally brings me to the passion paradox. Whereas mega events inspire excitement in some people, it instills anger and rage in others. And I think the number of people we've seen taking to the streets in Brazil for the Confederations Cup, the World Cup, to a lesser degree also during the Olympics, are evidence of this passion paradox.